Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, July 10th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our first article today, New York sues companies over forever chemicals. The lawsuit claims that the companies, including 3M and DuPont, contaminated the environment and engaged in fraud by withholding information from the public about the harms of the chemicals known as PFAS. By Christina Karen and Hillary Howard. The New York Attorney General on Thursday sued several chemical and manufacturing giants, including 3M and DuPont, accusing them of continuing to expose consumers to products containing chemicals linked to health problems and environmental damage long after the companies knew of their danger. Big companies like 3M and DuPont knowingly sold toxic products that threatened New Yorkers' health and polluted our environment for decades, Attorney General Letitia James said in a statement on Thursday. It's time for them to pay for the damage they caused. The chemicals, called PFAS, or per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, have been used in items like nonstick cookware, makeup, dental floss, food packaging, and possibly leggings. Though the chemicals were originally hailed as revolutionary for their ability to repel water and oil, they have since been associated with an increased risk of cancer, metabolic disorders, decreased fertility in women, and developmental delays in children, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. Often called forever chemicals, PFAS do not degrade and instead accumulate in the environment as well as in the body. Nearly everyone in the United States has been exposed to PFAS and has them in their blood, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The chemicals have been detected in wildlife, too. There's a very well-documented body of science that these chemicals cause serious harm, said Judith Enck, the president of the advocacy group Beyond Plastics and a former EPA official. This is a blockbuster legal action that should hold companies accountable for the immense harm caused by their products. The lawsuit claims that products manufactured by 3M, DuPont, Chemours, and Corteva violated New Yorkers' rights to clean air and water, as well as consumer protection laws. The companies also engaged in persistent fraud, the lawsuit claimed, by failing to warn New Yorkers of the health and environmental risks of their products. 3M was aware of and repeatedly acknowledged internally the substantial risks posed by PFAS as early as the 1960s, the lawsuit states, citing a 1963 report that described some of the chemicals as completely resistant to biological attack. By 1976, the lawsuit says 3M had confirmed the presence of PFAS in the blood of its employees, as well as in blood samples from the general public. The company that would become DuPont knew as early as 1961 that a type of PFAS was toxic, according to the lawsuit, and like 3M, it learned that PFAS were detected in blood samples of its workers. The company confirmed that continued exposure is not tolerable. However, it did not disclose any of its findings to the public, the lawsuit states. It was not until the early 2000s when a court order forced DuPont to release thousands of internal documents that the harm from PFAS was broadly exposed to the public. The companies named in the lawsuit did not immediately respond to a request for comment. They have faced thousands of other lawsuits over PFAS contamination. In 2023, for example, 3M reached a $10.3 billion settlement to be paid over 13 years with U.S. cities and towns over their claims that the company had contaminated drinking water with PFAS. The lawsuit asks the companies to fund cleanup efforts throughout New York and orders them to warn customers about the risks of their products. The lawsuit also seeks damages for harms to the state and its population, restitution, and other financial penalties. The lawsuit is the first by New York concerning forever chemicals in consumer products. The state previously sued many of the same companies over cleanup costs related to PFAS in firefighting foam. But towns and counties have been embroiled in such battles for years. This summer, DuPont is expected to pay $27 million to residents of Hoosick Falls, a village in upstate New York. The payout will finalize a 2021 settlement between thousands of residents and a group of chemical companies that also included Saint-Gobain, Honeywell, and 3M. The state lawsuit also comes after a recent decision by the Trump administration to roll back some of the limits on PFAS in drinking water, which were established in 2024 under former President Joseph R. Biden Jr. And last week, the EPA approved several pesticides that could contain forever chemicals, according to some experts. EPA moves to loosen limits on pollution from trucks. The Trump administration wants to roll back some Biden-era restrictions on smog-causing emissions from heavy-duty vehicles. By Maxine Joslow. The Environmental Protection Agency on Thursday proposed to loosen limits on smog-causing pollution from a variety of heavy-duty vehicles, including tractor-trailers, fire engines, and delivery trucks. It was the latest effort by the Trump administration to encourage the use of vehicles that burn fossil fuels rather than running on electricity. The Biden administration, in contrast, had made a rapid transition to electric vehicles a centerpiece of its plans for tackling both climate change and hazardous air pollution. President Trump has derided Biden-era electric vehicle initiatives as an EV mandate and a Green New Scam. Last week, the president pardoned 9 men who had been convicted of selling or installing devices that illegally disabled the emissions controls of diesel trucks, making them far more polluting. The EPA said on Thursday that it would repeal some, but not all, provisions in a clean air rule that the Biden administration finalized in 2023. That rule was designed to significantly reduce emissions of nitrogen oxides from truck tailpipes. Nitrogen oxides are toxic gases that form when fossil fuels are burned. They create smog when they mix with other pollutants in the air on hot, sunny days. Breathing in smog can irritate the lungs, exacerbate asthma, and other respiratory conditions. The Biden-era rule did not mandate the sale of electric trucks. Rather, it increasingly limited the amount of nitrogen oxides a manufacturer's diesel engines could emit over time. Manufacturers could comply by strengthening the emission controls in their diesel engines, or they could choose to forego those extra costs by making more electric trucks. Lee Zeldin, the EPA administrator, said the Trump administration would largely maintain a Biden-era requirement that manufacturers cut nitrogen oxide emissions by 80%, starting with model year 2027. Several manufacturers have already designed new diesel engines that meet this requirement. But under the proposal from the Trump administration, trucks would have to meet the emission standards for only the first 435,000 miles that they drove. The Biden administration had mandated compliance for the first 650,000 miles, saying the change would compel manufacturers to design more durable emissions controls that would not break down in older engines. In addition, the new proposal would require manufacturers to offer warranties for their emissions controls for the first 100,000 miles. The Biden administration had required warranties for the first 450,000 miles, reasoning that once a truck was out of warranty, the driver might disable faulty emissions controls instead of paying for costly repairs. Mr. Zeldin said the changes would lift burdensome restrictions that threaten to take trucks off the roads, erasing jobs and restricting the flow of goods. When I took this job, I inherited a set of rules that just weren't working for truckers, for farmers, and for so many other American families who count on them, Mr. Zeldin said during a news conference at the Great American State Fair, an event on the National Mall organized by Freedom 250, a Trump-backed organization. Speaking in front of a bright red big rig, Mr. Zeldin said the Trump administration was making key fixes to the last administration's problematic truck engine rule. He added that the proposal would shave $6,000 off the average sticker price of each new truck, though it was not immediately clear how the EPA arrived at that number. John O'Leary, the chief executive of Daimler Trucks North America, one of the largest truck makers, thanked the Trump administration for listening to the industry's concerns. "We don't expect to dictate regulations, but we definitely have opinions and we represent vast constituencies, and we just want to be heard," Mr. O'Leary said at the event at the National Mall, adding, "For us now to feel like we actually are being heard means a lot to us." The changes announced Thursday were part of a proposed rule, an early step in the regulatory process. After soliciting public comments for 45 days, the EPA will unveil a final rule, likely by the end of the year. While medium and heavy-duty trucks account for 13% of all vehicles in the United States, they are responsible for 58% of nitrogen oxide emissions from road transportation, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, an environmental group. Under the Biden administration, the EPA estimated that 72 million people lived within a mile of a truck freight route, increasing their exposure to unhealthy air. People of color and those with lower incomes were more likely to live in these areas, the agency found. Isela Ramirez is the executive director of the Moving Forward Network, a coalition of groups that work with communities to reduce diesel pollution. She grew up in Commerce, California, an industrial city southeast of Los Angeles, with a predominantly Hispanic population and 4 major freight rail yards. Ms. Ramirez said tens of thousands of trucks rumble through the 6.5 square mile city each day. She called the community a diesel death zone, noting that diesel exhaust also contains fine particulate matter, which is linked to premature death as well as asthma and heart disease. The EPA is continuing to act against its own mission to protect public health and the environment, Ms. Ramirez said. It's another slap in the face to communities that are already overburdened. The Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association, an industry group, said that it was still reviewing the proposal, but in general, the group supports the agency's continued engagement on cost-effective and achievable requirements for manufacturers, truck customers, and equipment operators, according to Jacqueline Gelb, the group's president and CEO. Despite the efforts of the Biden administration, electric trucks remain a rarity on U.S. roads. Out of roughly 416,000 medium and heavy-duty trucks sold in the United States in 2025, around 17,000 were electric. With significantly larger batteries than electric cars, electric trucks require powerful chargers that are not yet widely available. And many electric models cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, 2 or 3 times the sticker price of a diesel truck. But going electric can lead to lower fuel and maintenance costs in the long run. That is especially true as the war in the Middle East drives up diesel prices. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. A $3.2 trillion deal-making frenzy is spurred by the AI economy. This year's boom includes the most spent on global deal-making in a 6-month period in a decade, but questions persist about whether it can continue. By Lauren Hirsch. An ebullient stock market, huge bets on artificial intelligence, and an open regulatory environment have fueled one of the biggest 6-month booms in deal-making in years. Through the end of June, there were about $3.2 trillion in global deals, a 45% jump from a year earlier, according to Dealogic, a data provider. That was the most spent on deal-making over a half-year period in at least a decade. The frenzy heavily favored large companies, with 44 deals announced that were larger than $10 billion, including takeovers and large-scale fundraising in the private markets. Those blockbusters pushed the overall value of deals higher, even though the total number of transactions fell about 1% from last year, as companies with less financial firepower, or those more vulnerable to geopolitical uncertainties, stayed on the sidelines. Executives of many large companies, however, have brushed aside the uncertainties posed by tariffs and the war in the Middle East to pursue takeovers that are more likely to be approved by regulators under the Trump administration than they were during previous administrations. Many companies perceive they have a window in which to attempt to effect something transformational, and now is really the time to try to do it. Matt McClure, a global co-head of investment banking at Goldman Sachs, said in an interview. Bankers insist this time is different from previous booms, like the record low interest era of the COVID-19 pandemic, the leveraged buyouts of 2007, and the dot-com bubble in the 1990s. The companies driving this year's deal-making surge are among the world's largest and best funded, and many of them are aiming to transform their business by doing big mergers rather than making smaller acquisitions. Some of this activity is propelled by a need to simply keep pace in an economy dominated by only a handful of giant corporations. Consider that companies need to be about twice as large to enter the S&P 500 as they did 5 years ago. ExxonMobil, once the most valuable company in the United States, is about 1/8 the size of the largest of the so-called Magnificent Seven technology companies. The definition of scale keeps moving, so companies need to be bigger and bigger, and big companies need to do bigger and bigger deals to have an impact, said Ben Wilson, a co-head of North America mergers and acquisitions at J.P. Morgan. NextEra's $118 billion deal for Dominion Energy, which was announced in May, would create a utility giant aimed at supplying the increasing amounts of electricity needed to power artificial intelligence. SpaceX's $60 billion acquisition last month of Cursor, a startup that makes code-writing software, is aimed at helping Elon Musk's rocket company build its AI models. Typically, companies are reluctant to take on big deals in times of turmoil. Disruptions to oil supplies because of the war with Iran and the White House's open hostility toward America's biggest trading partners in Europe shows no signs of abating. Questions also persist around the AI build-out, such as the costs for computer chips, supply constraints, and potential delays on when these AI companies might reap profits. What makes the current boom a little counterintuitive is it appears to be associated with maybe not unprecedented but top quartile level uncertainty and volatility, said Jonathan Nee, a Columbia Business School professor and senior advisor at the investment bank Evercore. The deal activity has been a boon for banks too, with details likely to emerge when they announce earnings next week. Bank of America expects its investment banking revenue in the latest quarter to be up 28% from a year earlier, while J.P. Morgan Chase expects a 10% increase, according to a research note from Jefferies. Not every company has joined the party. In all, 21,727 deals were announced this year, down slightly from 21,997 at the same point last year. Some of that decline can be attributed to the challenges facing private equity. Companies owned by private equity firms made up 24% of the overall deal value, according to Dealogic, down from about 34% in 2024 through 2025. Many of these firms are grappling with the uncertain values of the software companies they acquired before AI posed a threat to them, making them difficult to sell. So far this year, it's just not been quite at the pace the market originally anticipated, Mr. McClure said. Initial public offerings during the first half of the year were dominated by larger companies bent on powering the race for AI and those in defense technology. Madison Air Solutions, a cooling company that serves data centers, raised $2.23 billion in an IPO, and Cerebras, a Silicon Valley maker of AI chips, raised $5.55 billion, and of course SpaceX raised more than $75 billion in the largest ever initial public offering. These offerings helped boost the value of IPOs in the United States to $155 billion, the most since 2021, when a flurry of so-called blank check vehicles stampeded into public markets. Bankers say the door for other offerings related to AI remain open. SK Hynix, a South Korean memory chip maker, is set to raise $28 billion in a U.S. listing this week. But the first weeks of trading for SpaceX shares have been volatile. While still above its IPO price of $135 a share, SpaceX stock on Wednesday dipped below $150, where it opened in the frenzied first minutes of trading when it hit the market last month. It closed at $148 a share on Wednesday. Other recent debutantes have seen their shares fall below their IPO prices. They include Cerebras, as well as Fervo Energy and X Energy, both of which aim to power data centers. About a third of companies that went public in the second quarter are below their IPO price, according to data from Renaissance Capital, a research and advisory firm. Matt Kennedy, a senior strategist at Renaissance Capital, said those results were largely in line with how IPOs had performed historically in their early months of trading. There are a number of examples of IPOs generating a lot of initial hype, then fizzling out, Mr. Kennedy said. At the same time, other speculative bets are holding up. Questions about whether demand will ultimately justify enormous spending on AI continue to swirl over the markets, along with other uncertainties like the war in the Middle East and inflation. Shares of the Magnificent Seven helped lead the S&P 500 through its best second quarter in 6 years, even as shares of those companies fell roughly 9% in June. Still, Mr. Kennedy said, I do think the AI theme will continue to drive activity through the end of the year. As consumers pare spending, grocery stores race to cut prices. While shoppers may get better deals on some items, it's unlikely their overall grocery bill will fall. By Julie Cresswell and Kim Bossin. Competing for strained consumers, America's grocery stores are cutting prices on some key products. That doesn't mean overall grocery bills will be lower. Walmart, the nation's largest retailer, said Monday that it would lower the price of ground beef rolls, fresh corn, cherries, potato chips, and Coca-Cola as part of a slew of summertime discounts. It's the latest grocery chain to do so, increasing competition in a relatively low-margin industry reliant on people buying shopping carts packed with items, including some at more profitable prices. The grocery industry has struggled over the past 18 months as higher food bills, reductions in food stamp programs, and the rise in the use of weight loss medications have led shoppers to buy less. On top of that, elevated gas prices due to the war with Iran are also hitting shoppers' wallets. A May CNN poll found that 61% of Americans had changed which groceries they bought in order to stay within their budget. High grocery prices have been a political issue for several years, so much so that President Trump sought to take credit for Walmart's announcement, posting on social media that the retailer will be lowering prices by a lot at my administration's request to celebrate our great country's 250th birthday. Walmart did not mention Mr. Trump or his administration in its press release. But while shoppers may get better deals on some items, their overall grocery bill is unlikely to fall. Prices across all food categories are expected to rise 3.2% in 2026, according to the Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service. While egg prices have dropped from last year's record levels, the USDA predicts that prices of beef, pork, poultry, sweets, non-alcoholic beverages, fresh vegetables, and fresh fruit will increase this year. That comes on top of the 18% price increase in food consumed at home since the beginning of 2022, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Beef prices continue to hit record levels this year. Walmart said it will reduce the price of its 1-pound log of ground beef to $5.94 from $6.74. In the 4 weeks ending in late June, prices in 61 food categories rose 3.4% from the same period a year earlier, while the volume of goods sold slid 2.1%, according to analysts at Stifel, a financial services firm. To lure consumers to their doors and hopefully persuade them to buy more, Several grocery store chains have reduced prices on a few dozen items, or the top 10 food products consumers typically buy. They have also increased the number of less expensive store brand products on their shelves. It's not going to be across the board. It's not going to be across 40,000 items, said Phil Lempert, a food industry analyst and the editor of SupermarketGuru.com. Consumers are also changing where they shop and are making fewer trips to traditional grocery stores in favor of discount grocery chains like Aldi, a company that originated in Europe and is quickly expanding in the United States, according to a grocery shopper study by the consulting firm AlixPartners. Retailers, still trying to maintain profits to keep investors happy, are looking for ways to fund the price reductions. On a call with analysts in May, Walmart executives said at least some of the price cuts could be funded by the $2.4 billion it had filed for in reimbursements after the Supreme Court ruled in February that Mr. Trump exceeded his authority in establishing sweeping tariffs on imported goods. In many cases, the reduced grocery prices likely reflect better deals grocery retailers have gotten from manufacturers, Mr. Lempert said. Food and beverage manufacturers, eager for consumers to put more of their foods in shopping carts, often offer discounts or other promotions to retailers, he explained. The average grocery retailer is only making 1.5 to 2% net profits on groceries, he said. There's not a lot they can do to take price cuts on their own. Earlier in the year, executives at PepsiCo said the company was lowering some prices to drum up demand or volume for its snacks and foods. On Thursday, PepsiCo reported that prices in its North American food business, which includes Frito-Lay chips as well as Quaker Foods breakfast and snack bars, were down 2% in the second quarter compared with the previous year. Executives said the lowering prices at many stores had helped boost demand in the quarter. They noted, however, that higher gas prices translated into weaker sales at convenience stores. Executives at Kroger said on an earnings call in June that the retailer would push harder in negotiations with suppliers, but would also fund discounts by cutting its own expenses. In May, Stop & Shop, a unit of the Dutch supermarket operator Ahold Delhaize, said it was lowering prices on more than a dozen food items in its New Jersey and New York stores. The price of a rotisserie chicken fell $1 to $6.99, and a can of Bumblebee tuna was cut to $1.99 from $2.29. The grocery retailer chose the products based on customers' everyday purchases across a variety of departments, Daniel Wolk, a spokesman for Stop & Shop, said in an email. Since making the price cuts, Mr. Wolk said, the chain is seeing encouraging signs that customers are filling their baskets with more volume. He added that the original cuts were part of a phased approach and that since then, prices on thousands of items in stores throughout Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey had been reduced. Costco said in May that it had cut prices on everyday goods, including eggs and beef, which had significantly affected the retailer's margins. The Warehouse Club slashed prices on items like chicken wings and chocolate almonds. Our goal is to be the first to lower prices where we see opportunities to do so, Gary Millerchip, the chief financial officer of Costco, told investors on a conference call. Target said in March that it would reduce prices for pantry staples after lowering prices on thousands of food items late last year. Executives at Kroger, which owns several regional store chains, including Fred Meyer and King Soopers, told investors in June that the retailer was conducting price tests to figure out which products it could lower prices on to attract consumers. The objective here is to get to a situation where customers feel comfortable that the price they're getting when they shop in a Kroger store or a Kroger brand is actually fair and reasonable, Greg Foran, the newly named chief executive, said on the call. Retailers are also increasingly leaning into placing more of their own brands onto shelves, hoping to drive customer spending on less expensive store versions of spaghetti sauce, frozen waffles, and baked goods. Whole Foods Market, which was famously nicknamed Whole Paycheck for its higher prices, has been trying to alter that perception by expanding its store brand offerings and cutting prices. We've reduced prices on more than 900 products across private brands, including the $3.65 by Whole Foods Market private label selection, a spokeswoman for Whole Foods said in an email. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Tanker attacks risk overplaying Iran's hand and reigniting a war. Iran's history shows it is willing to dig in, even when it may suffer big losses. By Neil McFarquhar. Iran, fearing that its hold over the crucial Strait of Hormuz shipping lanes was gradually slipping away, risked overplaying its hand by again firing on oil tankers and potentially rekindling a major war with the United States, analysts said. Both sides threatened on Wednesday to scuttle the Memorandum of Understanding that they had signed on June 17th to establish a blueprint for peace talks and extended a wobbly ceasefire in place since April. American warplanes carried out even more intensive attacks on scores of targets across Iran overnight, while Iran vowed to ratchet up drone and missile strikes against U.S. allies in the Persian Gulf. The basic bargain in the vaguely worded 14-point Memorandum of Understanding was that Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz for commercial shipping in exchange for badly needed economic relief. Thornier issues, including the fate of Iran's nuclear program, were kicked down the road for further negotiations, but very little changed. The MOU increasingly looked like a mirage, said Vali Nasser, a veteran Iran analyst and a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. The view from Tehran is that the U.S. is engaged in a concerted effort to take control of the strait out of Iran's hands, to weaken its position in Lebanon, and to regain its own strength in order to put even more pressure on Iran or to go back to war. As the 60-day clock on the agreement ticked away, Iran grew increasingly frustrated that the U.S. Navy was encouraging maritime traffic to take a southern route along the coast of Oman, rather than respecting Iranian demands that all traffic register with its newly minted Hormuz Transit Authority, a precursor to charging fees. Traffic last weekend was about one-third of the pre-war level of more than 100 ships daily, split evenly between the Iranian and Omani sides of the waterway, according to Kepler, which tracks marine traffic. In addition, the United States was working to conclude a separate peace between Lebanon and Israel that would include the long-elusive goal of disarming Hezbollah, Iran's main proxy force in Lebanon. Finally, in public discussions about financial aid, the scale kept shrinking. Instead, even amid the week-long funeral ceremonies for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader killed in the war in February, the Iranians decided to strike rather than wait for their leverage to dissipate, analysts said. Projectiles hit 3 tankers transiting the strait on Tuesday, although Iran did not claim responsibility. The perception by Iran that it had bested the United States and Israel in the war earlier this year likely helped lead to the renewed confrontation, analysts said. Having withstood this pummeling from the U.S. and Israel, they are probably feeling quite secure, said Suzanne Maloney, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, who has advised both Republican and Democratic administrations on Middle East policy. I think the timing of the attacks, coinciding with these funeral ceremonies, demonstrates a bit of triumphalism on the part of the regime that they finally essentially eradicated themselves from the war. They're able to bury their dead, and they're still firing back. There's a message in that for sure. Even if shipping had flowed freely before the war, the message from Iran was that it intended to enforce a newfound chokehold over the strait, analysts said. The United States, which had lifted oil sanctions against Iran that had been in place for decades, immediately reimposed them. Iran professed not to care. Revenue is subordinate to control, Majid Shakiri, an Iranian economist and advisor to Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the parliament speaker and lead negotiator, said on state television. Either we hold on to the strait, or every single one of us becomes martyrs for it. Still, both sides make a habit of fierce rhetoric and bluster, analysts noted, and tend to use warfare as a form of negotiation. Mr. Trump did not entirely dismiss the idea of getting negotiations back on track. Ultra-hardliners in Iran have long assailed the very idea of negotiations, so there have been calls to withdraw from the Memorandum of Understanding over the situation in the Strait. I think it is mostly posturing, said Nate Swanson, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council who previously served as director for Iran at the National Security Council under President Joseph R. Biden Jr. I think it is akin to what Trump is doing. He is negotiating through kinetic actions and loud threats, so in some ways they are speaking the same language. Iran was betting that Mr. Trump, expressing annoyance with the conflict and facing difficult midterm elections in 4 months, would not gamble on restarting an unpopular war, analysts suggested. Yet Mr. Trump unleashed a tirade against the Iranians, assailing their leaders as evil and scum, and suggesting that the United States would hit Iran even harder. He called the ceasefire over. They risk misreading President Trump, which they have done over and over again, said Joel Rayburn, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, who was a retired U.S. Army colonel and a former special envoy for Syria during the first Trump administration. Iran has a long habit of taking provocative actions like firing on the tankers and then acting as the aggrieved party, he said. They are overplaying their hand. It would not be the first time. Right after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the new hardline government in Tehran held on to American embassy hostages for 444 days, far longer than they served as useful bargaining chips, and had billions of dollars of assets in Western financial institutions seized in return. In 1982, Iran declined a truce in the Iran-Iraq War, leading to 6 more years of brutal fighting and hundreds of thousands of casualties. Trump's NATO summit and everyone else's. While President Trump insulted allies and demanded loyalty, the military alliance moved quietly closer to accepting more European responsibility for defense. By Stephen Erlanger. The 2-day meeting of NATO leaders in Ankara, Turkey, which ended on Wednesday, was a tale of 2 summits. The first belonged to President Trump, who dominated the news cycle with a steady stream of complaints, grievances, and insults aimed at his NATO colleagues, with his unpredictable changes of tone and mood, and with his decision during the meeting to unleash new airstrikes against Iran. As usual, Mr. Trump's targets were many: the alliance itself, some of its leaders, their various failures to show loyalty to him, the Spaniards and the Iranians. But the second summit belonged to the alliance itself, as it worked to show its commitments to more military spending, more transatlantic industrial cooperation, and continued support of Ukraine in its war with Russia. That summit was marked by a kind of quiet, steady progress toward a new kind of NATO, the one Mr. Trump says he wants, where Europeans would take primary responsibility for the conventional defense of the continent, letting Washington concentrate its resources on the threat of a rising China. It really is a tale of 2 summits, said Ian Lesser, a distinguished fellow of the German Marshall Fund based in Brussels. You have all the pre-existing concerns about the Trump agenda, some on display yesterday as he ticked off all his grievances, he said, speaking on Wednesday. And then there is the more traditional summit with a preset agenda, which is a lot about money and how to spend it, which declared support in the communique for collective defense and Ukraine. And that was important, Mr. Lesser continued, referring to the document issued at the end of the gathering. It was odd to have these 2 summits at once, as if in 2 parallel lanes, he said. He noted that Mr. Trump's good relationship with President Erdogan of Turkey helped to keep it relatively calm. European leaders mostly shrugged off Mr. Trump's insults and invectives, in large part because they were familiar and not coupled, at least in Ankara, to specific threats or actions that could undermine the alliance. Mr. Trump's repeated insults and empty threats are wearing off, said Natalie Toki, a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Europe. If he were to say we're pulling 40,000 troops out of Europe, something specific, that would really rattle. But so long as it's adjectives and vague threats, it's not so meaningful. She said Mr. Trump's summit was a political show, adding that it was supposed to be the main show, but it isn't. There is concrete stuff happening at the alliance level, she said. Jana Puglirin, who runs the Berlin office of the European Council on Foreign Relations, said Mr. Trump's hostile talk about Europe still has an impact. It is eroding trust in America, but to an extent, other leaders are getting used to it, she said. But when combined with concrete actions like American withdrawals of some troops and military systems, she said, it isn't just rhetoric. Still, she said Europeans are finally convinced that NATO has to change and adapt in order to survive. There is an increasing realization and pragmatism about the need for more European troops and resources, she continued, to make sure that NATO is not completely paralyzed by a Russian provocation that the U.S. decides not to see. The irony is that while Mr. Trump remains fixated on what he says are the faults of the alliance, NATO is working hard in its quieter way to transform itself precisely as the president is demanding. In Ankara on Tuesday, the alliance highlighted intensive new transatlantic cooperation among military-industrial companies, which are investing to attract the large amounts of new spending the allies are providing under American pressure. For Mark Rutte, NATO's Secretary General, this is another way to show Mr. Trump that American companies are interested and are benefiting from NATO's new commitments. On Tuesday, he said, allies sealed $50 billion in new weapons deals and agreed to invest 27 billion euros, or around $31 billion, in fuel storage and distribution pipelines, including on NATO's eastern flank. Mr. Rutte has already done his best, through flattery in part, to show Mr. Trump that the allies were paying up. Visiting him in Washington before the summit, he presented charts in the Oval Office showing over $1.2 trillion in extra defense expenditure since Mr. Trump's first term, including a 20% increase in 2025. One chart was titled in golden capital letters, the Trump Trillion. Last year, at NATO's summit in The Hague, allies thought that committing to spend much more money on defense, 5% of national income by 2035, would appease Mr. Trump. But this year made it clear that money is not enough. Mr. Trump renewed his threat to seize Greenland, the territory of a NATO ally, and complained indignantly that allies did not support his and Israel's war in Iran, even though he did not inform them about it or ask their aid. The frustration among other leaders is that Mr. Trump somehow refuses to grab the win, as Mr. Rutte urged him in Ankara. By the end of the summit on Wednesday, in his closing news conference, Mr. Trump was more emollient. He said the summit had displayed a lot of love and a lot of unity, and he went out of his way to praise Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Rutte. According to President Emmanuel Macron of France, Mr. Trump did not berate allies in Wednesday's closed session, though he strongly emphasized the need for Europeans to be serious about more military spending. On the plane back to Washington, Mr. Trump had a few more nice words for the alliance. "We had some good sessions," he said. "I think NATO came a long way today." But what is most striking is the divergence between the messages of Mr. Rutte and those of Mr. Trump, said Tori Towsing, a former official on the National Security Council and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Allies are stepping up with more money and production and support for Ukraine, she said, but the U.S. and Trump are their own show, she said, with the president showing up to rant at allies. Mr. Trump has won the argument that Europe has to step up and spend more, and that's a huge achievement, she said. But they can't land the win, which is to lead the alliance and stay politically engaged and give Europe the consistency and stability it needs to plan. Instead, we're not getting that. We're getting the Trump show. In the end, she said, the Americans are shouting in the wind here, and the Europeans are moving on. Sinan Ulcan, a former career Turkish diplomat and security analyst, also spoke of how the summit was a Trump show, with all his theatrics. But that doesn't change the reality that NATO is undergoing and will need to undergo a transformation, and it will come out in a way that rebalances U.S. and European contributions, he said. Ideally, we'll look at a weaker, transformed NATO, but one that is good enough. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. China, Russia, and others seek to inflame debate over AI data centers. State actors in China, Russia, and Iran have sought to exploit the U.S. public debate over the effects of the technology. By Stephen Lee Myers and Dustin Volz. A state-owned newspaper in China recently published a satellite image of a data center in Gainesville, Virginia, writing in English that the development of artificial intelligence posed a threat to America's physical and financial well-being. A comic strip made it look as if it had been published by a Maryland news outlet, created with OpenAI's ChatGPT by people in China, the tech company said, circulated on X this year, blaming data centers for soaring electricity bills. It showed a tycoon smoking a cigar and clutching bags of cash. A video shared on X by a known covert Russian influence operation questioned the viability of a data center that an American company, Firebird, is constructing in Armenia, the small Caucasus nation that has been the focus of Kremlin pressure. The country's electrical grid instability may render it useless, the video's narrator says. All are examples of a push by foreign adversaries to seize on what polls have shown is deep ambivalence, verging at times on hostility, about the spread of the data centers needed to power AI in the United States and elsewhere. China, Russia, and to a lesser extent Iran have sought to use state media outlets to turn the controversy over data centers in the United States into a domestic fracture point, according to a new analysis by Alethea, a threat intelligence company, which identified scores of articles and posts on social media this year. These campaigns, whose impact on public opinion remains to be seen, have raised alarms in Washington, where AI is seen as a top issue heading into this year's midterm elections. The foreign efforts appear intended to stoke the debate over data centers that has united political figures across the political spectrum, from Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, a progressive, to Stephen K. Bannon, the erstwhile advisor to President Trump. Foreign actors aren't manufacturing American debates over the future of AI, they are exploiting them, said Jessica Brandt, a former official with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, who tracked foreign influence efforts during the Biden administration. The goal, she added, is to deepen our divisions in order to dent our appeal and weaken us from within. Republicans and business lobbying groups have seized on the role of China in particular, claiming that the country's Communist Party wants to undercut American leadership in a field that the Chinese, too, hope to dominate. They argue that China's propaganda is an effort to slow down American development. We can't allow any effort by foreign adversaries to extort these fears and undermine our technological development, Senator Tom Cotton, Republican of Arkansas, wrote to the acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, referring to genuine public concerns. The Trump administration, which after taking office dismantled many of the government teams that tracked foreign influence operations, has begun to recognize the political threat of the rising sentiment against AI. A Gallup poll in May found that 71% of Americans were somewhat or strongly opposed to having a data center built near them, almost 20 percentage points higher than those who opposed construction of a nearby nuclear power plant. Many have broad concerns about the effects of AI on jobs and the climate, while people who live near data centers complain they are eyesores and emitting annoying sounds. Some cities and counties have enacted temporary or permanent moratoriums on new construction. In a recent interview on Fox Business, Doug Burgum, the Interior Secretary, suggested that the outside influence campaigns had succeeded in building opposition to data centers. I think some of this propaganda is being effective, he said. Foreign campaigns follow a familiar playbook that dates back at least a decade. They often try to leverage official news organizations and social media to fuel domestic discord around hot-button issues like guns, race, and vaccines, or even natural disasters like wildfires in and around Los Angeles last year. Between January and June, state media in China, Russia, and Iran mentioned data centers roughly 700 times, according to Althea's analysis. That was an average of nearly 4 times a day, though it remained a small fraction of overall published content about AI development. The outlets have featured articles and posts aimed at an American audience, as well as content highlighting criticism of data centers by prominent Americans, like Tucker Carlson, the conservative commentator. In Iran, state media has also highlighted links between American AI companies and Israel and criticized the race to develop the technology as reckless. Covert Russian information operations, previously identified by government officials and researchers, have recently begun to focus on data centers as a wedge issue on social media, but so far their Chinese counterparts have not done so in the same way, according to Alethea. OpenAI did disclose last month that a small number of operatives working in China used the company's ChatGPT platform to generate covert social media campaigns on X, including the comic strip. Other posts by the operatives promoted claims that data centers were spiking electricity costs and criticized Mr. Trump's tariffs as a blunt tool used to win the technology race. OpenAI, though, found little to no authentic engagement with the campaigns, and the accounts at issue were ultimately removed from X. OpenAI did not respond to requests for comment about Chinese and other foreign efforts. The New York Times has sued OpenAI and its partner Microsoft, accusing them of copyright infringement of news content related to AI systems. They have denied those claims. Lobbyists have also weighed in to insinuate that American opposition has been fomented with support from abroad. Power the Future, an energy industry group, argued recently that domestic opposition to data centers was manufactured by environmental groups financed in part by foreign donors, like Hans-Jörg Weiss, the Swiss philanthropist and conservationist whose foundation is well known for supporting environmental issues. Another pair of reports by the Bitcoin Policy Institute, a cryptocurrency advocacy group in Washington, also detailed what the group's researchers called an extensive multi-year influence campaign by China to sway the AI race. As evidence, the report cited an invitation by Mr. Sanders for 2 Chinese government-linked academics to attend a conference on Capitol Hill in April. They also criticized political donations to liberal organizations from Neville Roy Singman, an American tech entrepreneur who is based in Shanghai and has long been a subject of criticism for supporting Chinese propaganda campaigns. Mr. Sanders and Mr. Singman did not respond to a request for comment. The Chinese government, through its embassy in Washington, disputed accusations that it was trying to stoke protests in the United States, something it has accused the United States of doing inside China. Not all of the anti-AI content has an overtly political purpose. Other actors appear to be exploiting the issue simply to build engagement. Alethea tracked a network of inauthentic accounts on Facebook that has been posting images appearing to highlight Americans' opposition to data centers. They include images generated by artificial intelligence showing, for example, a field of crops carved into a massive obscene hand gesture, each tailored to users in different American states. This is what Oklahoma thinks of data centers, one says. The network has digital traces linking it geographically to Bangladesh, Alethea found. It includes dozens of groups or accounts on Facebook and Instagram that feature names like Life in Texas or I Love Minnesota. Amid a steady stream of AI slop are posts opposing data centers. Mackenzie Sadeghi, a principal analyst at Alethea, called the posts rural rage bait. Data centers are likely the ideal topic for engagement-maximizing operators, she said. It is locally salient in all 50 states, fresh, and it maps onto pre-existing anti-China, anti-tax, selling America grievance. The Bayeux Tapestry arrives in UK after maximum security operation. The 11th century tapestry will go on display at the British Museum in September. Tickets for the exhibition have already been selling rapidly. By Alex Marshall. The Bayeux Tapestry arrived at the British Museum in London early Friday after a secretive nighttime operation involving multiple police forces. The first time the fragile embroidery has left France in several hundred years. Regarded as one of the world's great artworks, the artifact is over 220 feet long and depicts events surrounding William the Conqueror's invasion of Britain in 1066. French art experts have previously said the tapestry was too fragile to travel abroad. Yet on Thursday evening, a truck carrying it in a climate-controlled and vibration-dampening crate left Bayeux in northern France at 6:15 p.m., accompanied by French security services, according to the country's culture ministry. Then the tapestry traveled by train under the English Channel. Once it arrived in Britain, the British police accompanied the truck throughout its journey to the British Museum, where it arrived at 2:50 a.m., according to the ministry. The tapestry is scheduled to go on display at the British Museum from September 10th through July 11th, 2027, in an exhibition that is already proving exceptionally popular. After tickets went on sale this month, the British Museum announced that it had generated over £2.5 million, about $3.3 million in first-day sales. At one point, about 80,000 people were waiting in an online queue to buy tickets to see the tapestry in the country where many historians believe it was made. Nicholas Cullinan, director of the British Museum, said in a news release that moving the tapestry had been a monumental effort and that watching it arrive in the museum's loading bay was a moment I will never forget. British Museum officials have repeatedly asked to borrow the tapestry since the 1950s, but French officials have rebuffed those requests. Then, in 2018, President Emmanuel Macron of France announced during an Anglo-French political summit that a loan would occur. In the 8 years since, the prospect of that loan has waxed and waned, with some French art experts setting up a petition insisting it must never happen because of the tapestry's fragility and the potential for damage from vibrations during transport. The tapestry has 24,204 stains, 9,646 holes, and 30 tears, according to a 2020 report. On Friday, Macron published an opinion piece in the Times of London about the tapestry. This loan from France means much more than simply moving an artwork, he wrote. It is a gesture of trust, a tangible expression of a long-standing friendship, and a sign of our shared desire to see France and the United Kingdom build their future together. The British Museum said in its news release on Friday that the tapestry would undergo condition checks before being carefully installed within a custom showcase ahead of the exhibition opening. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, July 10th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening.